Hi, and welcome to the History Summit. I'm Joe Adelman, the author of Revolutionary Networks, and I'm going to talk to you for a few minutes today about my book, and then I'm happy to engage and chat with you on social media. So my book, which you can see the cover here, is called Revolutionary Networks, The Business and Politics of Printing the News, 1763 to 1789. And it starts with a pretty basic premise, which is that we think we understand the revolution, the American Revolution, that is, but we're actually missing a key piece. So over the years, lots of scholars have made arguments about the political debates that loyalists and patriots had based on the printed text that they used to have those arguments. And lots of scholars have emphasized that they know that the arguments that people were making were important because they were printed and circulated. But most of the time they stop right there. The fact that they were printed is all that they say, and then poof, revolution. But it turns out that something did happen during the process of getting materials printed and circulated, and that work took place inside printing offices. So printers, who were the master artisans who were the subject of the book and who ran these printing shops, exerted enormous influence behind the scenes on what news was reproduced, on where it was sent, and on how it was then portrayed in their publications. Much of this work happened in newspapers, but it also happened in pamphlets, in almanacs, occasionally in books, basically in anything that these printers produced. And the techniques that printers learned and used to shape politics emerged from the business practices that they had developed over decades, just doing the ordinary course of business. And so it reflected their business interests as much as, and in fact sometimes in contradiction to, their political interests. The work of researching the book involved two processes. So first, I constructed a database of over 750 master printers who were active during the late 18th century, so I could see how they were connected to one another. Who was an apprentice with who married someone's daughter, where did each of these men and some women work, what kind of government positions did they have, and what kinds of networks did they try to develop through those. And then I also read an awful lot of publications from the era, a lot of newspapers, both from some of the great digital news databases and as well as in archives, to see the process of how news circulated and traveled around the Atlantic world. And in doing those twin things, I began to see how printers were shaping the process. For today, to keep things short, I'll give you one small example and then talk through one of the bigger stories, and then I'm happy to answer more questions. So as part of their ordinary work, printers collected news from around the British Atlantic world to reprint in their newspapers. They selected a range of newspapers, used paragraphs from those papers to include news from those places in their own newspapers. As they did so, though, they often changed the context in which one read any given piece of news. So, for example, over here, nearer to me on the left, is a reprint of the July 11th, 1781 New Jersey Journal, published by Shepard Collick in Chatham, New Jersey, which is near where the Continental Army's camp was. In that issue, he printed a story by way of Philadelphia, as you can see, that there was a major naval battle between the British and the French near St. Croix. He printed that and then sent off his newspaper to a variety of places. One of them we know was Worcester, Massachusetts, where Isaiah Thomas was the publisher of the Massachusetts Spy. And that copy is his copy of the newspaper, and we know that because he wrote on it. So he marked his copy with a line down the side for his journeymen and apprentices to know to set the type that he wanted to print that in the Spy, and so it was reprinted. But he added something. It's a little hard to read his handwriting here, but he says, "This account wants confirmation." And if you look to the one that's further away from my little circle, that's the reprint from the Massachusetts Spy, which adds those four words. It turns a relatively straightforward account of a battle into a rumor. This seems like a small decision, and it is. I will be totally honest about that. But these kinds of decisions happened a dozen or 24 times for every newspaper every week published in North America. There's hundreds and hundreds of these decisions. that are happening in newspaper offices. I wish I knew why Thomas had made this particular decision, and I don't. But these decisions multiplied by the dozens and over several decades had a huge impact, and it's printers making those decisions. So from the Stamp Act crisis on, which is where the narrative of the book starts, I try to show how printers developed their networks to lead protests, sometimes to support British imperial policies if they were loyalists, but to protest against things like the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts, to circulate news about the Boston Massacre. To do that, they connected and sometimes joined groups like the Sons of Liberty and the Committees of Correspondence. And that paid dividends in 1773 with the Boston Tea Party. So lots of people know at least the basic narrative of the Boston Tea Party. In December of 1773, tea ships arrived with tea that was to be sold by monopoly by the British East India Company to the colonists. Colonists objected. In Boston, 3 ships arrived in the harbor. Sons of Liberty wouldn't let the ships unload. Customs officials wouldn't let the ship leave without unloading and set a 3-week deadline. And at the end of those 3 weeks, customs officials were planning to board the ship and force the goods off. Before that could happen, patriots and Sons of Liberty with soot on their faces and dressed in what they described as Mohawk attire boarded the ships and dumped the tea. This is the Boston Tea Party. From there, they wanted to spread the news. So they put Paul Revere on his horse. I always feel bad for the horse. And sent him off to New York and Philadelphia. He arrived in Philadelphia about 8 days later, which is about twice as fast as news ordinarily travels. And one of the first things he did when he got to town was go to the printing office of William Bradford, who published the Pennsylvania Journal. And Bradford took the news that he'd been given and turned it into this broadside, a Christmas box for the customers of the Pennsylvania Journal. And it looks like most newspapers of the era. And if you just look at it like this, you can see that there's some news from different places, but it's a relatively smoothly laid out account of what happened right around the Boston Tea Party. But because we've done this research, I can show you how this one-page broadside was actually put together and how it reflects the networks that printers had developed. So first, in red are these several paragraphs that are labeled as Boston, December 16th. These were published the morning of the Boston Tea Party in the Massachusetts Spy, that same paper published by Isaiah Thomas. And it contains accounts of town meetings that were going on in the days before and negotiations with the ship owner, some resolutions from nearby towns like Lexington who were refusing to drink tea, and a variety of other related items. Then in green, there's a letter from the Boston Committee of Correspondence to the New York Committee of Correspondence. So we've got a lot of printed stuff. We've also then got letters that are reprinted, announcing that the tea had been dumped and celebrating that fact. And then last in the middle, we have this account just labeled Thursday. As far as I know, this account appears nowhere else. I've looked for it. My suspicion is that this is what Paul Revere walked into William Bradford's office and told him when he arrived in Philadelphia, that this is an oral account which happened all the time in newspapers, and this is an account of the Boston Tea Party. So this news becomes useful then for Philadelphia because by coincidence, its tea ship shows up the next day on Christmas morning in Delaware Bay. And what they do is they bring the ship captain into town. They stop the ship before the customs officers can get their hands on it, bring the ship owner into town, show him this Christmas box, and essentially tell him that he doesn't want anything happening to his ship, and so he might want to turn around, which he agrees to do. They give him huzzas and send him off back into the Atlantic Ocean in January. I also feel bad for the sailors on the ship. This news circulated through networks. It circulated from printers to committees of correspondence to other printers. It used all the various different kinds of media that printers use to produce their news, whether that's other printed items or letters or oral accounts. And then it's able to have a political impact almost immediately because it has news. It's news you can use. The book then continues on through the Revolutionary War, and I've shown you this map. This shows essentially the printers who were forced out of their towns. Almost half the printers active in 1775 were forced out of their printing offices at some point as as either the British or the Continental Army occupied towns. So the war caused huge disruptions to the printing trade. In terms of politics, in terms of the economics, in terms of supplies of paper and ink were very hard to come by during the Revolutionary War. So that by the end of the war, there's actually quite a different trade. There's a lot of new people coming into the trade. But as I show in the book, they're using a lot of the same techniques. So there's a printer who's incredibly important in the 1790s named Matthew Carey, who's an Irish immigrant. He shows up in 1785 with nothing in his pockets, except that he happened to be on a ship coming from Dublin to Philadelphia with the Marquis de Lafayette, and got Lafayette to recommend him to George Washington, and so was able to get an endorsement from George Washington for his magazine, The American Museum. So printers are continuing to do this work of trying to build networks, of trying to make connections, of trying to create an American communications infrastructure through the 1780s. I hope you enjoyed this introduction to the book, ever so brief as it was. I've put my contact info here, my Twitter account if you want to get in touch with me there, my Facebook account, and don't forget to check out other videos and resources at historysummit.com.